Hey, this is Brendan.
Hey, it's Carol.
And I'm Marianne, and we are the hosts of the Kiln Sitters.
As the end of the year approaches, we're reaching out to ask you to donate to the Brickyard Network.
You can help this show by supporting the Archibray Foundation with your donation.
To donate, visit brickyardnetwork.org and scroll down until you see the Donate Now button. Thanks so much and happy holidays.
Na, 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 na. Okay,
Na, 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 na.
Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com. Welcome back to episode 447 of the podcast. Thank you all for tuning in. Today on the show, I'm talking with Mary Savig, who is the Lloyd Herman Curator of Craft at the Smithsonian's Renwick Gallery. She was also one of the co-curators of the 50th anniversary exhibition, This Present Moment, Crafting a Better World. The bulk of the exhibition features 135 recently acquired works from women and artists of color who are expanding the canon of craft. In our interview, we talk about the curatorial themes of the exhibition, how museum acquisition campaigns work, and the profiles of a handful of artists that were featured in the show. The exhibition will be on display at the Renwick until April 2023, so if you're anywhere within driving distance, I hope that you will go check it out. It was one of the best exhibitions I've seen in quite a while. Without further ado, we'll get to the interview. Your essay was wonderful, and it was so literary that I feel like there's a lot of references that I actually wrote them down in my phone, like, oh, this comes from that. I actually loved how the essay brought in so many different threads from other writers and thinkers into your thoughts about the show. I thought it was really masterfully done.
Well, thank you. That was, it was a really fun process. I've never written like that before, and it was very unusual circumstances writing for the catalog and also bringing the essay together because we were in the throes of an acquisition campaign while we were writing. So as things came in, I adjusted the essay. So it really was kind of building this constellation. So as I was thinking of new works when they were coming in, I was able to make these literary references. So it's not a typical process for a curator. I think normally when we start an exhibition, we have a really great idea, a very, strong theme. And then from there, you build out a beautiful checklist that supports your theme and your argument. But with this process, it was totally backwards. So everything kind of happened at once, which was exciting, but also a huge challenge that we could talk about more.
Let's start off talking about the history of the Renwick and then how you came to work there in 2020, right? That was your first year?
Yep. Yeah. So I'm one of a series of curators at the Renwick who focus on craft. The Renwick opened in 1972. So when I came on board, we were aware that the 50th anniversary was coming up soon. So that was the first project assigned to me. And this was January 2020. I had already been at the Smithsonian for 12 years, and I had worked at the Archives of American Art, where I listened to your podcast quite a bit because I worked a lot in oral history. So, of course, I really loved your podcast and talking to artists. So I was already really involved with thinking about artists as primary sources, not just through their work, but also how they are constructing archives and speaking about themselves and their work and thinking about their firsthand accounts. So in January 2020, I came over to the Renwick and really started digging into the Renwick's history. And of course, getting to know the collection, which I just knew very superficially while I was at the archives. Probably better than more craft collections because we're all under the Smithsonian, but was really interested to learn more about the circumstances of the Renwick's foundation. And then COVID happened. So I think we had the idea and we had the momentum, and then we just kind of adapted as the museum changed and the museum was closed. And of course, craft fairs and craft schools were closed. So that really affected how our campaign operated too. But yeah, I think I got ahead of us. I can talk a little bit about the Renwick's founding.
Sure.
In the catalog, Nora wrote a really great essay that I think is rethinking the Renwick's history. So she would be a wonderful guest on the podcast, just thinking more about Renwick's history. So the Renwick as a building has been around in Washington since 1859. It was the nation's first purpose-built art museum. So William Corcoran was this wealthy banker and art collector and wanted to found a museum dedicated to the arts. And he wanted it to have a high profile in front of the government. So he built this building specifically across the street from the White House so people would value art and culture in the U.S., you know, just as being across the street from the White House and having this very high profile and giving it a lot of credibility. So he opened the Renwick, and construction started in 1859 by James Renwick, who is a famous architect. He also built the Smithsonian Castle famously. And this was a new design for him. It was considered the Grand Empire design of Paris, or what is it? No, I didn't say that right. I think it's the Grand Empire style. So we have very distinct architecture of the time. It was very chic in Paris, and the Renwick opened. Then the Civil War happened. Corcoran went to Europe because he was sort of a Southern sympathizer. He sympathized with both sides because he was getting money from both sides, but that wasn't going to work in DC anymore. So he went to Europe and continued to really build his art collection. So by the time he came back, his collection was bigger than the building. So he moved over across the street and built another museum. The Renwick became part of the federal government for decades, and it really fell into disrepair. Then famously, Jackie Kennedy saved it as part of her campaign to save some of these historical buildings. This was in the 60s. So in the 1960s, the Renwick, it was going to open under the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and we're still under the umbrella of the Smithsonian American Art Museum. And I think the idea was to have it be some period rooms, you know, that you would see at the Met or Art Institute of Chicago, very historical looking rooms with decorative arts in them. And then this curator over at the Arts and Industries building, who was working on a World's Fair show, Lloyd Herman, made a proposal to do something with American craft. This was the heyday of the studio craft movement. He had seen Objects USA when it was traveling through Washington. It was at the Smithsonian American Art Museum a few years prior. So he saw it and he was interested in the studio craft movement. So he pushed a proposal forward to the secretary of the Smithsonian's desk and suggested maybe make this a museum of art, craft, and design. And that was accepted. So the Renwick opened in 1972 with our mission of our mission focusing on American craft and design. We really focused on craft after the Cooper Hewitt, our cousin museum in New York, opened. That focuses much more on design. But the inaugural program really did sample a lot of categories of what we would call craft and design. So the main program was Wooden Works, a furniture show that highlighted the work of 5 American furniture makers. I always forget one. It's like naming the reindeer. There's always one I forget. But it was George Nagashima, Art Carpenter, Wharton Esherick, Sam Maloof, and Wendell Castle. Yeah. So those are the first 5. And there's also Pueblo pottery exhibition, a glass exhibition where they borrowed works from American history, and just a whole range of shows. And for the first few years, the Renwick did not really collect. It was seen as more of like showing traveling exhibitions. Some exhibitions were put together really quickly to respond to dignitaries and foreign governments who were visiting the White House. So we're right next door to the Blair House, and that is where foreign dignitaries stay. So President Macron from France was recently here, and so he stays next door. So we have a very unusual security situation all the time too. So, we're like, all of our activities have to go through Secret Service, which adds another layer of complications, and also really factored into thinking about the 50th anniversary too, because during the pandemic, this area became a security zone following some protests in front of the White House where protesters were pepper sprayed. So pretty much everything around here was put behind a security fence. So we really are in the heart of Washington, and we have been showing craft for 50 years, and we wanted to celebrate that. And we also wanted to really think about craft histories in a way that the Renwick had not considered before, that were maybe left outside of the studio craft movement. And so those were some of our main goals, were to build our collection in a really meaningful way that could truly represent what we consider American craft in the right now. So I don't know if that was very articulate, but
it was.
Okay, good.
The show, This Present Moment, is the culmination of a collection campaign, which you mentioned that. But I wanted you to just describe how objects get into the Renwick's collection, because I think most people might assume that you guys just have so much money that you just see an artist and buy a work. But the layers of getting the work to you on display, there's a lot of layers. So can you explain that with the collection campaign?
Sure. Yeah, there are a lot of layers. I wish we had all the money in the world, because I would support every artist in the US. I really would. I know it's so important to be able to just support the community by representation in museums. I know that's so important to artists' careers. So I wish, if I ever win the lottery, I think that's what I'm going to do. So yeah, for the acquisition campaign was unusual, because normally we have a pretty modest budget for acquiring works, and this is usually through a combination of donations and acquisitions. So usually we receive works by donors who are collectors in the field, and then we acquire works directly from artists or from galleries. And for the campaign, we did have extra money from Wingate. There was an endowment that they helped us build to be able to celebrate our 50th anniversary, and a series and a really wonderful group of supporters. We had an acquisitions committee that was chaired by one of our commissioners, Myra Weiss, and the wonderful quilt scholar and quilter Carolyn Muslumi. So they helped steer a committee of people who were from all over the United States, a lot of different interests in American craft, and helped us fulfill basically our priority list and really try to meet our collecting goals. For the campaign, we set a goal of trying to acquire 100 new works for the collection. It was very successful. We acquired nearly 200. So if I can, I would love to thank our registrars and conservators. This was a massive amount of art to bring in a short period of time, especially during a global pandemic when we had to think about social distancing and trying to get works in safely so we could review them safely. And our registrars really had to work overtime to be able to bring in this extraordinary amount of work. And as you know, objects are tricky. They're sometimes a lot trickier than paintings and maybe like marble sculpture that comes in. Instead, we have very precarious pieces that need to be handled much more sensitively. So even that, just the fact that it was craft coming in, added another layer. So they really did a wonderful job, and I'm going to try to not collect so much for the next few years, just so they can catch up a little bit. Because we do work with an entirely different museum across town, the Smithsonian American Art Museum. So their worlds do not just rotate around the Renwick. But so that was the campaign, and as I said, we did have acquisition funds, and for those funds, our goal with that was to be able to make really strategic purchases that directly filled our priority list. So we have a collections plan, like all museums do, that has several components. That's like identifying strengths in the collection and how we can build on those, identifying holes and how we can build on those. So we set forward with that. And when the pandemic happened, we quickly pivoted, and we wanted to make sure that we could support living artists with our acquisition funds. We were thinking about being able to purchase some key works from, the 60s or 70s with those funds, but realizing that so many artists could no longer teach or take their work to shows, we wanted to focus those funds on living artists. So that was one change that was a direct result of the pandemic. And we were able to really make a lot of really exciting acquisitions with that. The other piece was they were coming from donors. So those were works that people had collected, or they knew the Renwick was interested in. So we would do a presentation, and someone would say, I'm a quilt collector, and I really love the quilt that you would like to get, so I'm going to acquire this quilt for you. And so we had a lot of donors who helped us identify things that we wanted and then purchased them for us or had them in their collection. So once there was something that we as the curators wanted, and by the curators, I mean myself, Nora Atkinson, who's the curator in charge of the Renwick, who wrote the collections plan. So we were all operating under her really well-written and articulated plan, and Anya Montiel. And Anya was our curator for a year from, I think, about February 2020 through the next winter, she had a very long title. She was the American Women's History Initiative Curator of Native Women's Art and Craft. I'm sure I got that wrong, but it's something with those words in it. So this was a Smithsonian-funded position for a year where she worked part-time at the Renwick and part-time at the American Indian Museum. Anya's a specialist in Indigenous art. And so for us, she helped us bring in some really remarkable works while she was here. And then after the year, she went to American Indian full-time. So we're still in touch with her all the time, and she's really a wonderful curator. So together, we would all identify works that we knew were available. We knew the artists had completed. We were in touch with the artist or whoever had the work. And then from there, we would do these. We usually, as part of any curatorial process, you do research on the work. You present it to the stakeholders. So in most cases, that's our director, and she approves it. Sometimes, depending on how much the work is valued, we also had to present it to our board of commissioners. These are trustees of the museum, and they also approve it. So it does go through these layers where most of the works that I wanted to acquire, first Nora would approve them, and then Stephanie Stebish, our director, and then at times the commissioners. And then we bring it in to Washington to review, and our conservators, that's when they fully analyze it. Sometimes, in the past, they used to come with us, and we would ideally see it in person before we even say we want it, but everything was changed during the pandemic. So we would get our eyes on it, make sure it's in good condition, and then we can move forward with it. But sometimes that takes a long time. I'm kind of making the process seem smooth, but sometimes it takes several months, especially because we are part of the government. So our procurement systems are very Byzantine and frustrating. We treat, unfortunately, they have to, everyone who we're giving money to is basically treated like Boeing or all of these like government agencies, like, because the government doesn't distinguish between an artist who's selling like a handmade face mask or someone who is, this like huge mega contractor. So we have to help artists and galleries navigate that system too. So I, once again, really appreciate everyone's patience during these long bureaucratic delays. So, and then it comes in and then we can accession it. And sometimes that takes up to a year. So just from start to finish, from when we're interested in the work to being able to fully accession it.
So when you start a campaign like this to get 100 objects, you've got your wish list, but then I would imagine sometimes the work might be sold. There might be something that keeps you from actually getting what's on your wish list. But time was marching on, and you knew this exhibition was going to happen. So how did you sort of keep the exhibition plan intellectually in your mind, meaning the core concept of, and we'll talk more about this, but you had broken it up into egg, nest, house, nation, and universe, which is conceptually your foundation. But how did you keep that in mind, knowing that the objects might change depending on how this all went down?
That was the hardest part. Well, that the arrangement was the hardest. I have to say that's something I would think about in the middle of the night. I would wake up at 1 a.m. and think, like, how do we make sense of this? Because as I said, this was not an exhibition organized around an idea. It was organized around a campaign. And the campaign had specific goals of building on strengths, but also we had looked at the demographics. I mean, our museum represented studio craft at a certain time in American history. So it was less than 3% Latinx art, less than 3% of our collection was by Indigenous artists. So we knew we had to build on that really in very thoughtful ways. It's very deliberate in thinking about the holes in the collection. So yeah, we didn't always know. I mean, we had names on the list. We really knew for years, even before I started, the Renwick wanted something by Roberto Lugo, by Sonia Clark. These had been artists who had been on the museum's radar for, sometimes a decade. And I didn't know how to organize it at first. It's hard with an anniversary exhibition because our public, I love Renwick history. I could get into it. I love navel gazing because I'm a curator. I work at this historic institution, but the public doesn't care, honestly. Someone walking in who could be local or from Kansas, they do not care about the Renwick's history. They do not care about our greatest hits. They relate to the works because they're craft, because there's something about them that speaks to them. And I could sit in the galleries and tell them about the Renwick's history all I wanted, and it doesn't matter. That's not what they're there for. So there were other ways we could have done it. We could have organized it chronologically. That didn't really seem to make sense because I think that reinforces some of the fundamental problems with craft history in the United States that has created a canon that maybe doesn't always reflect the narratives that are throughout the nation. It's not a national representation. So we didn't want to do chronology. We also didn't want to do greatest hits because, again, that kind of reinforces who we think the gatekeeping of the fields. And it didn't seem like that would work. And it didn't seem like that would be relevant to people. So we really did stop and think, what is relevant to our audience? And it's ultimately the connection to the emotion of craft, I think, in a lot of ways. I think people who come here really do have very profound connections to the making, because if you come, sometimes you know something about how it's made, whether that's from experience or just intuition, like a quilt or a turn bowl, because people have held these things. So just this really basic connection. So then I was home a lot. I read a lot because I get insomnia, and obviously I stay up all night and stress about how to put an exhibition together. And so I read a lot to try to fall asleep again. And after a conversation with some students in Micah's fiber program, I was invited to be one of their outside critics to come and talk to these fiber students in Annette Cowenberg's class at Micah. And it was really amazing because these students they all had to go home and finish their senior projects at home. And their homes really ranged from like living with friends in Baltimore to like going back to China, where a lot of the students were from, or going back to like their childhood homes. So they all had to do these thesis projects from like, their basements or their bedrooms. And Annette, they did great. I mean, it's amazing what they were able to do. This one student like picked flowers around her house and was able to dye this fabric with it. And then she hand wove it herself in her bedroom. And it's just amazing she was able to do that when I felt like I could barely make it through the day, like taking a shower sometimes. But Annette in these conversations brought up Gaston Bachelard, The Poetics of Space. So I'm really thankful that she brought it up because I hadn't read that since grad school. And he's a French philosopher who talks a lot. He writes about the home and the poetry of home and how these spaces create these memories that are almost like poems, because our memories of home are often so fragmented, but they're so emotional. So he writes about that, and this is where he makes his argument by bringing in a lot of poetry. And as I was reading it, I was thinking like, well, this is how so many people connect to homes, with these objects in our homes that are so important for providing this stimulation of memory and also comfort and safety, which is an argument that he says we need to have this ability to curl up in our homes and become safe in our homes, because that's how we have creativity, and that's how we can daydream. And this is really important. If you don't have that safety, you can't think differently. You're just trying to get by. And so he quotes, and this is where it gets a little complicated, and I still have not found a great way of explaining this, but so he quotes a lot of poets. And one of the works that he paraphrases is Victor Hugo's The Hunchback of Notre Dame. And he's writing about how the Quasimodo, who's the character in The Hunchback of Notre Dame, who's known as the Hunchback, and he lives in the Notre Dame Cathedral. And this is because he's disfigured, so he's not allowed in Parisian life. He's not allowed to just like live with other people at this time. So he has to live in the cathedral. And Victor Hugo writes that it was his entire universe. It was his nest, his egg, his home, his nation, his universe. And when I read that, I thought, well, that's a great way to organize it, because craft can think along those scales too, of like feeling very safe and connected. Like you go under like a really heavy quilt and you just feel like you're like back in the womb. And then you can also think about the expansive universe. And craft really has these ways, I think, of helping us experience all of that. It's not something I'm making up. I think it's something the artists have always thought about, and how we identify with these certain scales, from the egg to the nest to the home, which is one of the biggest categories, not surprisingly, to the nation, and how the nation is even designed and how the nation is crafted, to the universe. So, and I also, I'm a huge Toshiko Takeizu fan, and we did not acquire her closed forms as part of the campaign. They had been in our collection for several years. And like I wanted to get those in no matter what. Nora and I had been talking about getting in those Toshikos for a very long time. So as soon as I read that, I was like, okay, great. We have our eggs, because she never called them eggs. She didn't write about them being eggs, but there is this unseen space in the interior cavity that's really important. So it was also a way for me to sneak in the Toshikos because I wanted them in. So that was the whole. And then just thinking that helps us, to our visitors, really just underscore like how craft can be relevant It's more than it is making teapots, and it is making bowls and cups and quilts. Like, that is what we're showing, but it also has this other use, that is the use of creating memories, creating the ability to even daydream or to imagine the world in another way. And I think that's where some of the work is really powerful, like Roberto Lugo's work, which is using these domestic luxury objects and saying, but this is another way of depicting them that allows us to tell different stories that um, prompt all of us to rethink the people who have been on these vases in our houses, or in the White House and places, that tells you who's in power and who we should remember, and then it's changing that, and that's prompting us to remember other people. So there's a lot of just different ways that the works are playing with those themes that we thought would be an interesting way of presenting it, that also allowed us to, because it is inherently craft, like, it didn't matter what was coming in because we knew it would be something that could speak to those categories. So even the things that came in late, I think one of the last things we got was Linda Sorman's work, and that just was so perfect for thinking about a nest, because she's using these weaving techniques that where they're like, it's like making a basket but with these strands of clay. So it just was a very organic way, I think, of organizing the exhibition that hopefully people respond to in different ways.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Hi, I'm Kara, content creator and Facebook wrangler for Amico Brent, bringing you ideas and support for your creative adventures every day. This week's episode is brought to you by Amico Brent. Find your favorite Amico glaze at your local distributor. Happy glazing!
Well, one of the things that I like about and I don't want to say that you start the exhibition with Toshiko Takezu's work, but it is when you walk in and go to the left, it's one of the first things you see, and that is the egg. So that kind of forms the nucleus, if you will, of the person's perspective to space. Because what I thought is you walk in and the pieces are, if they're not life-size, they're up on a plinth, so it makes them life-size. And then there's a large photograph in the background with her walking through some of her other forms. So you get this sense that you're small. And I think it's really nice to start the exhibition with craft, with the idea that the person is small and that person is then going to observe something bigger than them. So then when you go into the room with the baskets and the Linda Sorman piece, it changed the way I was thinking about the space. Like I felt like I was small still. Like I wanted to get close to the objects. I wanted to walk around them. I wanted to breathe them in. I wanted to feel them in a different way. But conceptually, that goes with the whole egg, then nest, then home. So like I thought that the way this laid out told a really nice story, that you incorporated all these works into the story you wanted to tell. So I wanted to go through some of these distinctions and talk about a few of the artists in there. And we won't have time to go through them all. But I wanted to start with one, and actually I'm not sure which part this is in, but it's Katie Hudnall's piece called The Nutcase. And it's 178 acorns that she had picked up as she has gone on walks out into nature, and she kept bringing them back to her house, and she eventually built this case to hold them. And she said this about something that I thought was interesting. This was when she was writing about it. She said, "I think the idea of constant, repeated, tiny attempts for success," and she was talking about acorns. Like with acorns, a tree, I think, might make 2,000 acorns, but only 1 in 10,000 actually grows into a tree. So for her, it was this sense of hope, like these tiny attempts at success. And I've never thought of an acorn like that, but seeing the box of those acorns, it just made me think of things differently. So can you talk about what you as the curator, how do you present that story in that piece?
That's one of my favorite works in the Renwick that I love talking about, the nutcase. Yeah, so that's actually upstairs. And that those galleries are laid out a little bit different because they will transition into our permanent collection gallery, but they are still mostly from our collections acquisition campaign. So they're mostly all new. And the way those galleries are organized is by time. So the first gallery is thinking about presence and how artists are trying to represent sort of the rawness of the present moment, whatever that present is. It doesn't have to be in 2021 or 2022, but whatever their present was when present moment was as they were making the work. The second gallery is thinking about the past and like how we reframe the past and how we are always adding to it as these layers. So that's where Katie's work is. And I also just love the idea, the way that she writes about these tiny failures over and over. And it's craft, right? I mean, even just an acorn, all 2,000 acorns that have fallen from the tree and only one becomes a mature oak tree. That's craft. I think that's all of the failures in the studio that maybe lead to something. And it's so slow. And I think that's a metaphor for her work and also for craft itself and also our lives. I mean, I think that's a beautiful way of thinking about our lives, is like accepting these constant mistakes and learning from them, but also understanding that not everything is going to be this transcendent victory. And I would love for people to shift it. Thinking about her work certainly shifts my point of view towards trying to embrace these smaller moments that also slow down time. They allow us to feel more present. As she says, so she would go on these hikes as a way to find herself present in her own body and to restore health to her body. And that really resonates with me, just thinking about going and noticing, especially during the pandemic when we didn't have anywhere else to go. I wasn't going to museums, so all of a sudden I noticed all of the mushrooms in the woods. But what I loved about this piece is that Nora and I met Katie in Maryland to look at it. So we were mostly doing studio visits virtually, but Katie, her family lives in Alexandria, Virginia, and she was going to go visit them. So she said, I'll bring the nutcase and we can all look at it. And we met outside. This was summer 2020, so pandemic was still full swing. We met outside. We're all 10 feet apart. And she came out of her pickup truck and carried the nutcase across this parking lot and set it up. And it was in a playground. And so it was so fun just to see her set it up. And it's full of these acorns. And it just felt really special. And I wish we could do that all the time with some of our works, is really engage in that way and I think hopefully eventually we can have a video of it closing up and opening and how it kind of collapses into this really great actual suitcase. And so just thinking about that also reminds me of being able to like have this experience again with the art. And I think that's just a great reminder for all of us to just try to go through life in this more deliberate way and to try to linger. Sometimes it's okay to linger in these failures. It's okay to really appreciate these acorns, even though they might not grow into an oak tree. And I also wanted to mention that work is really funny because it's inherently whimsical, but it's also very heartfelt and I think poignant, but also our registrars were nervous that people would steal the acorns because they're so little. So there's a piece of plexi over it that's not part of the original work, but Katie also did write an acorn replacement plan that's part of. So when we acquire something, you know, we do try to talk with the artist about what happens if this, you know, it looks like it might be heading in this direction. What do you want us to do? And Katie, I asked her to write down what would happen if we lost an acorn. And she just asked for the registrars to go on a long, deliberate hike and replace them. So not just to like go outside and find the first acorn, but she wanted it to be like her process. And so I shared that with the registrars, not sure if like I didn't want to sign them up for these like extracurricular hikes, but they were really excited about it. And I don't think they want anybody to steal an acorn, but I think the idea maybe they kind of are like, well, so I also love that. I mean, I think she's kind of carried that even through this like long-term preservation plan.
It's a wonderful piece too, because it's a metaphor in a lot of the ways for other things in the show, in terms of this was a conscious collection of artists of color and women, and in one sense, America has failed those populations over and over and over and over again, perpetually, and still continues to. But the collections in the show are an attempt to bring those communities into the Renwick collection. And I know they weren't excluded completely, but this was a conscious decision to increase the numbers and the people represented by a lot. And I think that's kind of in the same way that this piece talks about, that there have been failures to correct racism. There's been failures to correct misogyny. But there's this idea that like, we're just going to keep doing it, and we're going to keep going, and we're going to keep working, and we're going to keep doing it. So how do you think this show helps correct, I don't want to say some of the wrongs of the past, because I know putting an object in a museum doesn't change racism out on the street, but it does something. It creates representation for people that will see themselves in the museum. So can you talk about that idea?
It was so important to the curatorial team. First, we're the Renwick's first all-women curatorial team. All of the previous curators had been men. And people during the height of the studio craft movement that were collecting, that were making the decisions, they tended to just collect work that looked like them by artists that look like them. So all of these collections do look the same. And that's not to say that craft wasn't happening everywhere. And it was really important for us to be able to show all of these different channels of craft that are truly extraordinary. We had collected we had shown Pueblo art in 1972 when we opened. And there are always just different ways of more, the methodological approaches are different now. I mean, when it was first framed in 1972 as Pueblo art, there was a really anthropological approach. Now we're bringing different tools in. So I think that we're able to, for me, it's just showing the artist's voice always. I came from an archives background. Nora is also someone who's very deeply invested in who the artists are and like what stories they have to tell. You can tell those are the works that we selected where someone does have a very intimate story usually behind the work. So those are the ones that we're just drawn to. And I think that is what makes the work very relevant to people, to show why craft is relevant. Again, it just goes beyond being able to use a utensil in your home, but you can use these objects to see each other in a new way or to see yourself in the collections. And that's what we really are trying to do with building a national collection, is to be able to tell all of these and tell all of these different stories that are deeply personal. They're very, craft, I think, is very unique because it builds so much on intergenerational knowledge. And it builds so much on the workshop model. So we wanted to be able to highlight how important that is. And a lot of that is through storytelling. So that was one of the main thrusts of the exhibition and the collecting campaign, was to show that in a way that our goal wasn't to just check boxes either. It was really to be able to show some of the strongest parts of craft coming from around the country. And we were able to really rely a lot on our acquisitions campaign committee to build that out and make everybody in Washington feel like they can come and identify with something. And in turn, I think it's a pretty political exhibition. I think we embraced a lot of really tough topics that I think are really important to put in a national context, especially when we're across the street from the White House. I think we do have to talk about immigration in the US. I think we do have to talk about climate change. I think we do have to talk about racism and homophobia. There's so many things that if we are in this position that was built purposely to be across the street from the White House to show art in a way that has this national context, that's what we have to do. So I believe really strongly in that. And then for me, it's not necessarily me doing it, but it's following the lead of the artists. And that's where they're all at right now. And they're really setting an amazing example. And I really think it's the artists who can change the world, or at least help us to be more empathetic to each other. I think artists, especially working in craft, are showing us how to build coalitions that work across differences that can make these meaningful changes. So I really, it's something I believe in because I see the artists are doing it, like the artists like Katie are doing it, and Roberta Lugo and Sonia Clark. So I just want to be able to do what I can in this role to support that and amplify it.
Some of the more personal stories were in the titled section called Nation. And there's this piece by Consuelo Jimenez Underwood called Run, Jane, Run. And it's a large tapestry. And one of the focal points is that she is woven in the signage for an immigrant crossing sign that she saw on the 405 when she was driving one day. And she talks about in the catalog that it made her mad that there's a sign on the side of the highway that's an immigrant crossing sign in the same way that there's a sign that says deer crossing or any crossing.
Yeah, Animal Crossing.
Animal Crossing, exactly. And just what that means, that isn't in America, that immigrants, we treat them in such a way that they literally run here and not only could potentially die in the crossing of the border, but just crossing a major highway. Running across a major highway is an inherently dangerous thing. So can you talk about that piece and what that means? Because I thought that was one of the more political pieces in the outwardly political pieces in the show.
Yeah, that was in the Nation section. And it was in this space that our works by artists who work on the board have always worked on the US-Mexico borderlands. And Consuelo Jimenez Underwood has been making weavings about the borderlands for much of her really prolific career. And yes, she was angry when she saw that sign. The fact that there is a sign up that warns people that a family might be crossing an 8-lane highway just shows how many other systems have failed before there's a sign. It's the last thing that can warn people that these migrants are in danger and they are just trying to get across the border. And so many other systems failed them and also failed people in the US who now just have these signs up. And it's dehumanizing to think of people this way. And the signs are really a symptom of a very broken system. So I think that's what she's trying to convey in this work, that tries to bring humanity to the family that is on the sign. She had a daughter. She has daughters, and thinking about her own family and trying to just bring in their humanity as people and how they're being treated. And the title is called Run, Jane, Run. So it's after these reading primers, like See Dick, See Jane Run. And rather than running across this border, Jane should be learning how to read. And it's thinking about, again, like what should these kids be doing and what should these families be doing that the US the immigration system is not set up to help them. And that's how the other works in the gallery are also kind of speaking to this idea of the design of the US immigration system and how they can also design these responses to it that hopefully can help people see the system. I think in Washington, especially, the US-Mexico border is so far away. It's so abstract to people. It's more like political rhetoric talking about the border. We don't actually see the material effects of the border other than just, these pictures in the news of the looming fence being built. So this is a way, I think, in Washington specifically for people to kind of see what's going on and how people are traumatized by it and how people are making work from it in a way that helps us to see them differently, and then hopefully see the entire immigration system as something that is designed really to fail in a lot of ways, from the beginning to the legal system to how it's even talked about in Congress. So yeah, that's a political part of the exhibition. And I haven't really heard any pushback. So I think that's good. A couple people asked, like, is this show too political? And I haven't heard. Maybe it's because I live in a bubble, but I haven't heard pushback for that. So I hope we can I think it's because the objects are made in this way where you can see who they are in the works. You can really feel the presence of Consuelo in that work. And I think that's its power. And so we're kind of trying to take away the abstraction. So I think people are connecting to it.
Well, I like that. I like the idea that in a museum that's across the street from the White House, that you might actually have art objects, craft objects that can teach politicians more than them yelling at each other for their own personal power.
Hopefully.
Like you mentioned that those signs dehumanize, but I think craft can humanize.
Yeah.
And I think that's a beautiful part of this exhibition. And I wanted to end today's interview talking about another piece that really struck home with me. It's a Sonia Clark piece, the large flag piece. Well, it's actually, can you describe what it is? Because there's a backstory about the dish towel. Can you just tell that story?
Sure. So it is actually a giant dish towel on display. And her work is called Monumental. And it was one of the major works from our campaign. Sonia Clark was born and raised in Washington, so it was very important that we finally get a work by her. And this seemed like truly a Smithsonian work because a few years ago, Sonia was a Smithsonian Artist Research Fellow, and that's a program run by the Smithsonian where artists can come and do research at any of the Smithsonian museums or research centers. So people go to the zoo, people go to Air and Space. We've had a lot of great craft artists come through. And Sonia was at the American History Museum and she saw the flag of truce. And this is literally a dish rag. It's a dirty dish rag that the American History Museum owns that was waved in 1865 at the Battle of Appomattox to end the Civil War. So this is when the Confederate Army surrendered. And they found the whitest thing that they could to wave in front of General Lee's army, waved it to surrender. And then they met at the courthouse and had to agree to the terms of truce provided by the Union Army. So this is an important work. The dish rag is important because it signals the surrender of the Confederate Army. And I keep saying that because that's not something that a lot of people, especially in the South, and DC is kind of like has this sort of, we're like on the edge of the South. The narratives about the Civil War don't always talk about the actual surrender of the Confederacy. Following the war, there was this lost cause mentality that really has, I think, infected a lot of how people understand the Civil War. And with that are all of these monuments that are throughout the South that are dedicated to Confederate soldiers. The Confederate flag itself was really used as a tool of propaganda following the war to highlight white supremacy and to just sort of convince people as a tool of propaganda to think that like the South did win. The South was a lost cause, and the South somehow was like this rightful heir to American culture. So all of these things were meant to really undo this surrender. And for Sonia, she thought that was it's a very powerful object. So Sonia asked this great question that we also have on the wall. What if this flag of truce would become the flag we know about the Civil War and not the Confederate flag? And that is just it's so profound. When you're there in the gallery and you see people taking it in, it's impossible not to stop and think of if we didn't see the Confederate flag everywhere as this symbol of white supremacy and I think really toxic American racism, and how it shifts our thinking and thinking about truce as this value that we took for granted. And we didn't embrace that. Instead, it became this fight for the South, and all of these monuments went up, and there are all these, monumental equestrian sculptures of these heroic men. And Sonia's monumental is sort of the anti-monument to that. It's called monumental, but she took the dish rag. She made it 100 times the scale of the original one. That's the American History Museum that I've been talking about. So she made it 100 times bigger when she was at the Fabric Workshop in Philadelphia. And so it's on a huge platform. It's so big, it can't go on a wall. So it's on a platform, kind of like how the Star Spangled Banner has to be exhibited. And so it takes up space. It requires you to walk around it. And it's very simple. It's a waffle weave. It's linen waffle weave, so it's kind of this beige color. It looks like a dish rag because it has this very absorbent weave that you would maybe have in a dishcloth next to your sink. And then it's very unassuming, and it just is an anti-monument to these Civil War monuments that so many people in the South have been trying to topple for the last several years, that have become these symbols of, I think, propaganda in a lot of different ways. And they're intimidating. So this is sort of the antidote to that, to help people really imagine it differently and really see an alternative to the Confederate flag. And it's a very powerful piece. And we're very excited to be able to make that connection as the Renwick to these other collections at the Smithsonian that are about the Civil War. So, but I think you need to talk to Sonia Clark about it, because the way she talks about it is also so powerful. And it was truly, that was one of the most exciting things to bring in, because we're able to have these conversations in Washington, right across from the White House. And it's through her vision that we're able to even spark these conversations in a way that I think does. And I see it every day when I'm up in the galleries. It stops people in their tracks when they stop and ask the question that she's asking to themselves. And it just becomes this moment of like, okay, let's do something different. And let's acknowledge this legacy of slavery in the United States that continues to infect our justice systems, and think about what changes can be made. So hopefully, I think I'm optimistic that people will be inspired to maybe do something when they see this work. At least talk about it.
To wrap up, can you tell us how long the show is on display and anything else about it?
Sure. So the exhibition will be on view, I think, through April 2023. So there's still plenty of time to come and visit it. And the second floor, most of those objects will remain on view after that. And I hope everyone is able to come visit it. We do have a lot of ceramic works on view, so I hope people can come enjoy those and say hello if you come.
Well, thanks so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Sure.
I'd like to thank Mary for coming on the show. It was a pleasure to chat with her, and I am still digesting and thinking about this present moment. The exhibition is a show of force for craft artists that are helping me to think differently about both material and meaning. Again, that show will be up at the Renwick Gallery until April of 2023. I also wanted to thank today's sponsors. That's Amico Brent and the Archie Bray Foundation. As the end of the year approaches, we're asking you to donate to help support the Brickyard Network. You can help this show by making a tax-deductible donation to the Archie Bray Foundation. You can donate by visiting brickyardnetwork.org and scroll down until you see the Donate Now button. This is the last episode of 2022, so I really appreciate you guys tuning in throughout the year. This was the most listened year of the podcast, so I appreciate you guys checking in every week and hearing the conversations that I feel so fortunate to be a part of. I'll be back in 2023 with a few special series on this show that will be rolling out throughout the year, and then we're also going to be having a completely new podcast and a few new podcasts on the Brickyard Network. So make sure to keep in touch with us there at brickyardnetwork.org. Thanks so much and happy holidays. If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.
This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network, an extension of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.